Welcome to the Adab Lab on May 31st, 2026. Today, instead of having a geopolitical commentary, I wanted to do things a bit differently. I've been asked to explain why I called this channel Adab Lab. So today, our main conversation will be about adab, what it means as a civilizational concept. And then I will, at the end, you know, actualize or integrate the concept in contemporary conflict, just so I give our viewers a practical example of what do I mean by the term adab. So the title of our commentary will be What is adab in Arab and Islamic civilization? The ethics behind power and moral order. The commentary will be split into 5 parts. So let us begin. Part 1, the genealogy of adab as a discipline of the self. In the Arab Islamic tradition, few words carry as much weight as adab. Today, it is often translated as manners or etiquette, as I've mentioned previously. But historically, adab referred to something far more extensive, a disciplined process of forming the human being. The word adab for Arabic speakers comes from the Arabic root alif dal ba. However, in pre-Islamic Arabic, the verb aduba or adduba meant to invite people to a feast, ma'duba, an act of cultivated hospitality that implied bringing people together in harmony. From this sense of gathering emerged a broader idea of embodying good qualities, moving from hosting properly to behaving properly, and ultimately to being formed properly. Therefore, in pre-Islamic Arabia, adab referred to refined conduct, eloquence, hospitality, and poetic sensitivity. With the advent of Islam, the term deepened further, coming to signify a comprehensive moral and spiritual discipline. By the time of the Abbasid period, and during the Umayyad period as well, adab described an entire culture of refinement. This included literature, ethical training, education, and social intelligence. It was part of the curricula or the curriculum. To possess adab was to be properly oriented. Oriented towards what? Towards others, towards society, and ultimately toward God. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is reported to have said, quote, "O kama yuqal, my Lord taught me adab and perfected my adab," end quote. And in the Quran, in Surah Al-Qalam, it describes Sayyidina Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad, as the embodiment of perfected character. Surah 68, verse 4, it says, "Indeed, you are upon a magnificent character." Or in Arabic, وَإِنُّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. وَأَنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. From this foundation, classical scholars developed adab into a comprehensive framework. In the 9th century, Al-Jahiz, who passed away in the year 868 of the Common Era, wrote in his book, The Eloquence and Exposition, or in Arabic, Al-Bayan wa Tabyin, he presents adab as intellectual cultivation. Speech for Al-Jahiz reflects judgment and judgment reflects the ordering of the mind. Without adab, according to Jahiz, one cannot perceive nuance, cannot read context, and cannot act with wisdom. Here, adab becomes a form of cognitive ethics governing how we perceive and express reality. By the 11th century, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Hujjat al-Islam, who passed away in the year 1111, wrote in Ihya Ulum al-Din, or in English, The Revival of the Religious Sciences. He transforms adab into a discipline of the soul, the discipline of the nafs. He examines the adab of eating, companionship, and learning, but his deeper concern is the formation of the self. Knowledge for Al-Ghazali without adab degenerates into arrogance, and knowledge without adab becomes illumination. Adab, therefore, for Al-Ghazali is riyadatun nafs, the training of the self. In the 13th century, Ibn Arabi, who passed away in the year 1240, wrote in his renowned Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, or the Meccan openings. He develops adab into an ontological principle. He says every moment has its proper comportment and every state has its discipline. For Arabs, you might recall a quote or a saying that we usually say, which is similar to what Ibn Arabi is saying, which is لِكُلِّ مَقَامٍ مَقَال. Okay, every moment has its proper comportment. To violate that discipline is to, according to Ibn Arabi, is to misalign oneself with reality itself. Adab becomes the mode by which the human being aligns with the unfolding of the divine. Soon after Ibn Arabi, Ibn Taymiyyah, who passed away, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, who passed away in the year 1328, wrote in Majmu' al-Fatawa, or Collected Legal Opinions. He grounds adab in revelation, in al-wahi. For him, adab disciplines speech, disagreement. If you want to disagree with someone, you need to disagree ethically. Worship and authority. Here, adab becomes a structure of limits, an ethical boundary that prevents excess and distortion. Therefore, across all of these thinkers, Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Jahiz, Ibn Arabi, Al-Ghazali, there's a unified insight that emerges. For them, adab is a condition for perceiving and enacting truth within the self, in society, and in relation to the divine. Part 2, adab as moral, epistemic, and ontological order. As I said, adab is about order, not enforced or imposed order, but rightly perceived order. The Holy Quran establishes its moral structure clearly. It says in Surah 16, verse 90, Allah commands justice, excellence, and giving, and forbids immorality, wrongdoing, and transgression. This is the architecture of adab, justice, excellence, and restraint. It is not simply about rules, but about proportion, knowing what fits, where, and how. In Sunan at-Tirmidhi, it is said that Sayyidina Muhammad has said, quote, "The believer is not one who insults, curses, or speaks obscenely." Here, adab disciplines the tongue and through it the social world. The Quran also describes existence as structured balance. Surah 58, verse 7 to 8, it says, "He raised the sky and set the balance, so do not transgress in the balance." End quote. Adab is human participation in this balance. When it is absent, imbalance becomes zulm, injustice, and excess. But again, adab is not only moral, it is epistemic. It is a discipline of knowing, or a disciplined knowing. It requires restraint in judgment, caution in claims, and humility before truth. For Al-Ghazali, the obstacle to knowledge, it is not simply arrogance, but ego. A self dominated by ego cannot reliably perceive truth because their soul, their nafs, is polluted. At its deepest level, therefore, adab is also ontological. The essence of adab entails placing things where they belong, in the right order, in action, in thought, and in being. Part 3. Adab as a political ethic of restraint, dignity, and truth. When applied to power, adab becomes a political ethic. And this is extremely important considering what has been going on arguably since the beginning of the 20th century, but more so what we've been seeing unfold for the past 10 to 20 years after 9/11, especially in the Arab world. So when applied to power, adab becomes a political ethic. In Sunan al-Bukhari, Sayyidina Muhammad is claimed to have said, "The strong one is the one who controls himself when angry." End quote. Power without restraint tends towards tyranny. Adab disciplines power by restraining impulse. It also grounds human dignity. This dignity is not conditional. It is not granted or revoked by conflict. To violate it is to destabilize the moral order itself and the balance that we talked about earlier, al-mizan. Finally, adab regulates truth in political life. The Quran, again, says, "Stand firmly for justice, even against yourselves." This demands truth over ego and justice over allegiance. Without this discipline, politics collapses into faction and perception into distortion. Part 4. Adab and the breakdown of moral order in contemporary conflicts. So in this part, I will transform everything that I said that might sound extremely theoretical into a practical example, okay? And hopefully this will further clarify any misunderstandings for our viewers. So let's consider the ongoing violence involving Israel, Iran, Gaza, and Lebanon. 4 patterns are evident. And before I mention the patterns, I just want to mention something that we might already be familiar with. Reports constantly indicate large-scale civilian casualties, destruction of infrastructure, destruction of historical sites, and recurring cycles of retaliation from the Israeli side and from Iran or its mercenaries. The issue is not simply political alignment. Who are you with? Am I with Israel or am I with Iran? That's not the point. It's not political alignment that matters, but ethical structure. What happens when adab is absent? One pattern is the erosion of human dignity. Populations are often framed through a security lens, reducing civilians to abstractions within strategic calculations. In Israel's case, Critics point to doctrines and public statements that treat densely populated areas in Gaza as operational zones, where civilian presence becomes an unavoidable variable rather than a central moral concern. Restrictions on the flow of food, medical aid, and basic resources have further contributed, according to humanitarian organizations, to reducing civilian life to logistical terms. In Iran's case, its regional strategy, as I said, particularly when supporting non-state armed groups, let's say in in Lebanon, Hezbollah specifically, these groups are often embed their military activity within civilian environments. We're seeing this right now, whether it's in Jnub, the southern part of Lebanon, Nabatiye, Jabal Amil, Marj Ayoun, Hasbaya, etc. This risks transforming, and it has transformed, it doesn't risk, it's already happening, civilian populations into elements of strategic terrain rather than protected communities. The second pattern is a failure of foresight, istishraf al-mustaqbal. Actions that predictably produce widespread suffering point to a deficit in disciplined judgment. What classical scholars call adab al-nazar. When I want to do something, I need to make sure that I know what's going to happen when I do it. That is called adab al-nazar. Al-nazar is foresight. Okay. Israel's large-scale operations in densely populated areas have repeatedly led to high civilian casualties and long-term infrastructural destruction. Iran's strategy through proxy conflict, Hezbollah, the Hamas, the Houthis, Saraya al-Qudus, etc., similarly operates within a logic where escalation is foreseeable, exposing civilians in Lebanon and Israel to predictable cycles of retaliation. So, Israel does not have foresight. Iran's proxies don't have foresight. So if you have two factions that lack adab al-nazar, then you can be assured that you will have mutually assured destruction. A third pattern is the incorporation of civilian harm into strategic reasoning. What does that mean more simply? Where these factions are going to use the death of civilians as a strategic card, which not only violates adab, it violates any Abrahamic tradition, whether Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. In Israeli military practice, proportionality assessment weighs civilian casualties against military objectives. That is clear. We saw it in Gaza, and we're seeing it in Lebanon. Critics argue that expanding thresholds risks normalizing such harm. On the Iranian side, support for armed groups launching projectiles towards civilian areas, just like yesterday, Kiryat Shmona, northern Israel, reflects a strategic environment in which civilian vulnerability becomes part of deterrent signaling. In both cases, harm risks shifting from moral limit to strategic variable. A fourth pattern, and this is the final pattern, is narrative distortion. In Israeli discourse, official and media narratives may emphasize security necessity while downplaying civilian suffering, at times dehumanizing targets or generalizing populations in ways that narrow moral recognition. We saw this during Gaza when Prime Minister Netanyahu called people in Gaza as Amalek, when he failed to distinguish between Hamas and Gazan civilians. In the Iranian discourse, resistance, al-muqawama, is often framed as an obligation, while those who dissent risk being labeled as traitors, Zionists, or imperialists. In both cases, Israeli and Iranian, Such framing simplifies complex realities, disciplines public perception, and fragments moral visibility. Taken together, these four patterns, narrative distortion, incorporating civilian harm, failure of foresight, and erosion of human dignity, these four patterns suggest not only conflict, but they suggest a breakdown in moral order. What would the presence of adab require? Quite simply, recognition of human dignity, restraint in the use of force, truthfulness about harm, knowing when to stop, foresight in decision making, protection of the vulnerable. By the way, this is not an ideal standard. Everything that I'm saying sounds like common sense, and it is not idealistic. Okay, it is in actuality the minimum ethical threshold articulated by the Abrahamic tradition. And when I say Abrahamic, I'm incorporating all holy scriptures, the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. All of these holy scriptures emphasize this minimum ethical threshold. And if we read the works of learned exegetes, mufassirin, of the Old and New Testament, the Quran, they would all agree, and I've learned from these exegetes, that this is a minimal threshold. Part 5, adab as a way of seeing and acting. Adab is a disciplined way of seeing, thinking, and acting, one that restores moral clarity amid fragmentation. The Adab Lab is an attempt to take this framework seriously, to examine world events, political developments, and systems of power through the lens of adab as a moral, epistemic, and spiritual discipline. It's not to simplify complexity, but I want to clarify it. It's not about taking sides, but to ask what is right. Not to speak about what is happening, but how it ought to be understood. So, welcome to the Adab Lab, as it is here, I hope, where clarity begins.